Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. I'm Ishan Sharma, founder of Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. And today we are more than honored to have an icon, the Doyne of South Indian history writing, Professor R. Champak Lakshmi, with us to deliver her second Karwan Distinguished Lecture titled The Making of a Religious Tradition Pre-Colonial South India. Professor R. Champak Lakshmi is considered as one of the leading and the most senior historians in the nation who served as professor in the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and was also the president of the Indian History Congress. She has authored numerous books, including Trade, Ideology, and Urbanization, South India 300 BC to AD 1300, Religion, Tradition, Dissent, and Ideology, essays in honor of Professor Romila Thapar, The Hindu Temple, Sacred Sites, and Religion, Tradition, and Ideology, Pre-Colonial South India. Welcome to the session, ma'am. And without further ado, I would request Professor R. Champak Lakshmi to begin with the lecture. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. Tradition is often regarded as sacrosanct and monolithic, which reflects an unhistorical notion that it is static, unchanging, or immutable. Such a notion also assumes simple continuities in the past, as also from the past to the present, and points to the role that specific constructions of the past play in the politics of different periods of history and of the present. Often changes are represented as continuities due to an anxiety to establish the antiquity of a tradition or a conscious attempt to link irreconcilable elements to an accepted tradition as their source. It may be emphasized that the discourse of continuity remains significant in legitimizing and carrying through changes within tradition. They reflect social and political transformations and are also integral to the processes of such transformation. Processes of transformation can take on a variety of forms: confrontation, interaction, accommodation, and marginalization, leading to the fashioning of dominant traditions. Alternative traditions, opposition, and nonconformism are often accommodated or subordinated, the study of which leads us back to narratives of power. Religion is often treated as an autonomous domain, unrelated to and unaffected by the socioeconomic, political changes. The fact that developments of a significant nature have taken place at various points of historical time due to such interrelationships is not really easily understood. Hence, Hinduism has been perceived as a monolithic religious tradition derived from a single set of texts, that is, the Vedas, and its auxiliary texts. Such a view is not only ahistorical, but also ignores a whole series of contexts, temporal and spatial, here it is regional, in which several significant developments have taken place and contributed to the emergence of multiple strands and a pluralistic culture, wherein religion is only one aspect, albeit a major one. The making of India's religious tradition has been one of the most complex processes in the development of its culture. Hinduism defies definition as a religion. Much less does it fit in with the common cliche describing it as a way of life. It certainly is more than both. It is the result of a complex interaction between Vedic and later Puranic Brahmanism, that is called the Brahminical tradition, with innumerable indigenous cults, regional, local beliefs, practices, cult forms, and ethnic associations, ultimately contributing to the emergence of a pan-Indian tradition with interesting regional manifestations and variations. This is best illustrated by the development of religion in South India, its social base and institutions. Of particular importance are the various contexts, socio-political and economic, in which the Brahminical tradition reoriented and revitalized itself to provide a dominant ideology to the changing social, political, and economic order. The historical processes which carried Brahminical tradition from Aryavarta, that is the Ganges Valley, into the peripheral regions, is from the north to eastern and southern regions, show that there was a general pattern of its spread, in which there was a remarkable continuity in the core of Brahmanism, as also a change due to its immense capacity to adjust to radically different political and social situations, accommodate and rework itself. The Brahmanas were not, and are not even now, a homogeneous community, and yet an awareness of sharing common symbols, idioms, a scriptural language, and social values with the others of this Varna throughout the subcontinent developed among them, despite the regional differences and fluctuating patronage under different political authorities. The major strands in the Brahmanical tradition are represented by the Vedas and its auxiliary texts, the Vedangas, which are dated between 1500 and 600 BC, and subsequently by the Itihasa Purana tradition, Dharmashastras or Smritis, composed during the early centuries before and after the Christian era, and later in the early medieval times, 6th to 12th centuries, consciously upheld by the Brahmana ideologues to establish a society based on Varna Jati or caste organization, to create an ideal sense of Swadharma, and that is dharmic society, and a monarchical form of polity, both at the subcontinental and regional levels. In the process were created certain institutions like the Brahmadeya and Agrahara and the temple, and different forms of worship based on canonical texts known as the Agamas, which lay down the rules of temple construction, iconography, and ritual worship. Composed by Brahmana priests, the Vedas, representing the first major strand in the Brahmanical tradition, are hymns in praise of a huge Vedic pantheon, representing personified forces of nature and other mythical beings around whom a rich mythology was evolved. The central ritual of the Vedas was the yajna or sacrifice, offered through Agni, the fire god, as the medium. It was performed by the Vedic Aryan chiefs of pastoral tribes who seem to have migrated from Central Asia to northwest India, and that is Punjab region, in the mid 2nd millennium BC, and gradually colonized the rest of North India, especially the Ganga Valley, both by conquest and by intermingling with the earlier settlers, who may be agricultural mainly, and by the end of the period transformed themselves into territorially organized monarchies. The yajna was a ritual of legitimation of the Raja's power and control over the tribe. It was an occasion for beginning a war or celebrating a victory, and at the same time an occasion for the redistribution of resources by the king among his kinsmen, lineage groups, a sharing of wealth and making gifts to the Brahmana priests in a reciprocal exchange or prestation economy. The other major element in this socio-political organization was the fourfold hierarchical order based on the theory of Varna Jati, the Brahmana caste being the purest, Kshatriya the warrior, Vaishya the trader or the agriculturist, and Shudra in the service of the above other three. An order claimed to be divinely ordained. The priest and warrior castes controlled all the resources, while access to both the scriptures and the resources was denied to the others. Their intermingling with non-Vedic people brought about greater complexity and development of ideas relating to kingship, territory, and the state, with the yajna becoming more and more elaborate. Thus, the Vedas came to be established as, within course, the authentic scripture of the Vedic Aryan society, and was controlled and interpreted by the Brahmana priests. By the 6th century BC, the philosophy of the Vedanta was evolved by those sages or rishis who opted out of society as renouncers, countering the Vedic ritualistic tradition through the esoteric Upanishads, representing an intellectual response and spiritual awakening, that is, a metaphysical approach to understanding the universe. The Vedanta stands at the very beginning of India's intellectual discourse and as a source of all systems of Indian philosophy. It came to be commented upon by medieval thinkers and philosophers like Shankara and Ramanuja. However, the immediate response from the Vedic Brahmanas was one of accommodation by the incorporation of the spiritual stage in one's life as the fourth ashrama, sannyasa, that is, the ultimate in the four stages of existence. Thus evolved yet another key element in Vedic tradition, the ashramas along with the varna concept. The initial geographical horizon within which these traditions developed was confined first to the region of the five rivers, Punjab, and then to the Ganga Yamuna Valley, that is Doab mainly, and by the first millennium BC to the middle of the Ganga Valley, what is called the Aryavarta in the early texts. Many regions, including present Bihar and Bengal, remained outside of it as the country of the Vratyas, outside the pale of Aryan society in a cultural sense. In the following centuries, this culture spread throughout India, but with different degrees of intensity in its interaction with vernacular traditions. The same milieu, that of the Upanishadic or intellectual awakening, also led to the origin of other counter and non-conformist traditions by the 6th century BC, namely the Buddhist and the Jain, denying the Vedas, questioning the efficacy of the Vedic tradition and its institutions, particularly the caste structure. They attempted to establish equality among all sections of society. They introduced a major concept, namely the ahimsa, or non-violence, as their cardinal principle, which was to influence not only Brahmanism, but was to become an important ideological thrust to early states or empires like the Ashokan Empire, that is the Mauryan. Buddhism and Jainism acquired a wider popular base and provided an alternative ideology for the Vaishya or trading community for enhancing their social status. In the period of intensive trade, both inland and maritime, which characterized the period from the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century AD, with the mercantile community in the ascendant, Buddhism flourished both with royal and merchant patronage, and their dominance producing the most fruitful period in the development of early Indian art and architecture. The Shramanic religions of Buddhism and Jainism posed a more serious challenge and attained dominance in the pre-Mauryan, Mauryan, and post-Mauryan periods. Thus, in the period from 600 BC to 300 AD, the Brahmanical tradition, which claimed to represent orthodoxy and treated others like Buddhism as heterodoxy, began to reorient itself. The Brahmanical Puranas characterized Jainism and Buddhism as heretical, while at the same time drew considerable inspiration from their major doctrines. It was also perceived that to induct the indigenous population within the fold of Brahmanism, they would have to borrow, at least superficially, from the beliefs and rituals of these people. The post-Maurya and Gupta periods, 4th century AD Gupta period, witnessed large-scale migrations and diffusion of ideas to regions which were hitherto peripheral to their area of influence. It attempted to balance between the Brahmanical traditions and the regional ones. A new syncretic religion thus coming into being, which is described as the Puranic religion. Important changes in the Brahmanical tradition occurred during this period through a process of closer interaction with tribal, folk, and popular elements of worship and cults. Acculturation, adoption of non-Vedic deities, creating the Puranic pantheon, the central deities of which were drawn from non-Vedic and folk cults. The Puranas thus became the second major strand, that is the core of the development of Brahmanical tradition, presenting a new worldview. Though universal as a phenomenon in the Gupta and post-Gupta period, that is from 6th to 12th centuries, this process was not, however, uniform throughout the subcontinent. Hence the remarkable pluralism of the Hindu tradition, which may be more appropriately described as a complex mosaic, a conglomeration of reconcilable and often irreconcilable elements. It was the Puranic religion which was consciously promoted by the Brahmanas and their Kshatriya patrons in the changing historical context of the early centuries before and after the Christian era. That is important. It evolved its basic features in the Gupta period, 4th to 7th centuries, and represents a process which was central to the development of religion in India and its interconnections with society within the amorphous framework of what came to be known as Hinduism. Vedic Brahmanism and Puranic Brahmanism stand differentiated in time at least by 6 centuries, and also in their context and content. And yet, Puranic Brahmanism sought authenticity to the changes within the Brahmanical tradition by claiming continuity with an old and accepted Shruti Vedas, for the changes that it introduced in the Brahmanical tradition. Geographically, the Vedic religion in its origin was confined to northern India up to the mid-Ganga valley, whereas the Puranic process was initiated in the north, but significant developments took place in the areas peripheral to the Brahmanical sphere of influence, particularly peninsular India, where some major Puranas and Shastras were composed. Along with the epics Mahabharata and Ramayana, the Dharmashastra Smriti literature, the Puranas marked this contextual change and in effect organized religion and its social base. It is in this form that the Brahmanical tradition was introduced in the South, in a composite package as a fully amalgamated and structured whole. The Puranas henceforth became a paradigmatic process or the mainstream for incorporating regional differences. The Puranic tradition grew into a vast corpus with some regionally identifiable texts, rich and variegated in their myths and forms of worship, and even social norms suitable to the changing conditions. An obsessive fear of the Kali age, almost in the form of an accepted formula for stressing the need to adopt Brahmanical norms for society and polity, and the representation of such changes as a revival of Brahmanism to destroy the evil of Kali, are characteristic of all early Puranas. The Upapuranas composed at different times are also a case in point, for they are often regionally identifiable. The chronology of the Puranas is thus closely linked to the historical and regional context in which they arose. The inescapable need for ultimate authority led them to call the Vedas to witness, or as the authentic source for all such developments. The flexibility of the Puranas helped Brahmanism to penetrate into peripheral areas, the southern areas particularly, as Tamilagam shows. This process, the Puranic process, was synchronic and diachronic. With the evolution of the Puranic religion, the Puranic worldview and its cosmogony, mythology, and ritual forms, they found expression in the temple and its iconography. Agamic canons were evolved for temple building, image making, consecration, and temple rituals. These developments show distinctive regional patterns, and one such significant regional version of the Puranic tradition is that which emerged in South India and developed as the dominant tradition inscribed in the ideology of power. It also assisted in the formation of monarchical polities like those of the Pallavas, Pandyas, Chalukyas, and so on, and regional states like that of the Cholas in the early medieval times, and supra-regional states like Vijayanagara as their ideological instrument. Vedic sacrifices continued to be used as legitimating devices for kingship, even if only as a formal ritual. Dana, or gift, took the place of yajna as the actual means of redistribution. Normative texts like the Dharmashastras, Smritis, were composed laying down principles of social and political organization, including life cycle rituals and laws and legal institutions, establishing codes for property and inheritance, etc. Thus, Brahmanism reworked its traditions in the changing context of society and ensured its continuance. This neo-Brahmanism of the Puranic tradition handed down its resources to the whole subcontinent, and all the regions of India contributed to the development of this tradition as a synthesis between the Brahmanical and non-Brahminical or local regional traditions, often referred to as the great and little traditions by sociologists. Particularly significant was the meeting of the northern Sanskritic and the southern Tamil tradition, the latter having produced a rich corpus of literature as early as the beginning of the Christian era called the Sangam texts, the Sangam being a Tamil literary academy of the early historical period, the only such heritage of a non-Vedic corpus known so far. Pioneering historians called the spread of Brahminical tradition as the process of Aryanization within quotes, and applied it to the whole of South India with scant regard for the regional and cultural variations reflected in the nature of the sources from different regions. They often marginalized and even ignored the role of the non-Vedic or non-Brahmanical religions of Buddhism and Jainism. Such a model, that is Aryanization, freezes or perpetuates the view of the 19th century British observers that the Indian culture consisted of, within quotes, an ideal, typical, real pan-Indian civilization, close quotes, and a number of survivals from an earlier locally represented semi-civilized stage. Louis Dumont replaces this dualism with a monism, a general idea and its local workings. Such a view reduces all regional particularities to just a variation of a broader pattern, a mere epiphenomenon, which radically underestimates the reality and importance of regional and historical specificity in South Asia. The Puranic tradition is marked by the evolution of different pantheons around the chief deities Shiva and Vishnu, marked by regional variations due to differences in local cult forms. The temple, which was the focus of such developments, also developed two major styles of architecture, the Nagara and the Dravida, the geographical distribution of the two coinciding with the north and south respectively, with a mixed style in the middle zone called the Deccan. Cosmology, cosmogony, astronomy, and astrology, literary styles like the Kavya and the Nataka, the Natya Shastra, Vastu Shastra, and Shilpa Shastra, and even the art of love, were the themes on which the Sanskritists produced literature in the period between the 4th and 7th centuries, which came to represent the classical forms and were promoted from the 7th to the 17th centuries. All the new textual traditions adopted the classical forms to suit regional differences or rendered the Sanskrit texts in the vernacular, the most notable being the different versions of the epics Mahabharata and Ramayana, which were rendered as transcreations in almost every regional language, while episodes from the epics were either dramatized or performed in the folk media. Sanskritic tradition was in turn influenced to a large extent by the changes and interaction with other vernacular idioms. Resources of tradition were not always derived from Sanskrit originals, but often their local forms were just Sanskritized, retaining their vernacular base. South India in particular evolved several vernacular structures through socio-religious movements, creating counter-traditions like those of the Tamil Bhakti movement of the Alvar and Nayanar from the 6th to 9th centuries AD, providing the regional state of the Cholas with a major ideological construct for legitimating their power through the building of temples, making gifts to them, expanding the temple's role as a social and economic institution, and more importantly, as the symbol of political power, authority, and religious community. The regional Bhakti tradition thus acquired the position of the dominant tradition, which got inscribed into the ideology of power, thereby bringing into existence a distinctive politico-cultural region adopting Puranic structures and institutions. South India therefore offers the most interesting and complex forms of the development of the cultural mosaic that is known by the term Hinduism. It represents the most fascinating regional pattern of the Puranic process, which was central to the development of the Brahminical religion. The major strands, therefore, in the Brahminical tradition are the Vedic, the Itihasa Puranic, and Smarta, based on Smritis. And these represent three different strands in the Brahminical tradition. Notwithstanding the fact that these strands belong to different temporal contexts and spatial origins, it would appear from all the earliest known sources in South India that the Vedic and Itihasa Puranic traditions arrived in a package, almost in a fully amalgamated and structured whole, introducing a paradigmatic process for incorporating regional differences. To this package, the regions all of peninsular India contributed in the form of some early Puranas like the Matsya, Vayu, Vishnu, and the Dharmashastras. In the crucial transformative period that is between 6th century BC and 3rd century AD, in which Brahmanical tradition reworked itself to respond to the challenges posed by the Shramanic religions of Buddhism and Jainism, most of the early developments of considerable significance for the Puranic process have taken place in the areas peripheral to Aryavarta, or the land of the five rivers, and the mid-Ganga valley, to which Brahmanical sphere of influence was confined in the Vedic period. The process, as it is called by pioneers as Aryanization, need not be repeated because it's a cliche which everybody adopts for explaining the meeting of the Sanskritic and regional languages traditions. Conventional historiography has invariably failed to make the distinctions between the Vedic, Vedantic, and Itihasa Puranic tradition, which appeared at chronologically different and contextually varied historical situations. The term Hinduism is used in these writings for the long span of over 3 millennium of history, starting from the Vedic times to the present day, both in North and South India, thus losing sight of the historicity of religion and the processes in the making of a tradition. That is the unhistorical notion that tradition is static and immutable. Religious changes or mutations not only reflect social and political transformations, but are also integral to these processes. Many of the regional and local beliefs, which are still unexplored, ultimately contributed to the emergence of a pan-Indian tradition with interesting regional manifestations and variations. The Puranic process also led to the growth of a vast corpus of texts, with some regionally identifiable ones, as I mentioned, the Upapuranas. They are rich and variegated in their myths and forms of worship. The representation of such changes as a revival of Brahmanism to destroy the evil of Kali has already been mentioned. It characterizes all the Puranas. There is no denying the cultural pluralism of India, which retained its multiformity while adopting an apparently uniform religious tradition. When counter-traditions emerged, they aimed at projecting a new worldview or a new universe, but they were also accommodated within the amorphous framework of Hinduism, within quotes. A synthesis was achieved in the making of this tradition, which gave it a homogeneity, leading to the colonial construction of a Hindu tradition as monolithic. We may take up three such major periods or contexts to explain the evolution of this tradition. One, the early historical period, 3rd century BC to 3rd century AD in South India. The three strands in religious development, Vedic, Smarta, and Puranic, are attested in the Deccan, Andhra, and Tamilagam. Tamilagam is Tamil country. The Sangam Tamil classics, as much as the Satavahana and Ikshvaku epigraphic records, attest to the presence of this Brahmanical tradition in an amalgamated form, in addition to the visible presence of Buddhist and Jain religions. With no evidence of serious confrontation between the Brahmanical and Shramanic religions, the ruling elite sought legitimacy through Vedic sacrifices and Puranic worship. Interestingly, they also promoted Buddhism and Jainism in different degrees, Buddhism receiving royal patronage as well as the support of merchant and craft groups, and minor chiefly families who had matrimonial relations with major ruling families like the Shatavahanas and Ikshvakus. The early historical period, therefore, was one of intensive trade, inland and maritime, networks of commerce, monetary transactions, and urbanization in the whole of the subcontinent, with different degrees of intensity in different regions. But Buddhism was predominant, which is highly visible monumental architecture and sculptural art at various urban and monastic centers in the Deccan and Andhra. Yet neither the Vedic Brahmanical or the Shramanic tradition consolidated itself as the mainstream or dominant religious tradition. This happened only later, that is in the early medieval period, in the Deccan and Andhra from 4th century and the Tamil region from the 6th century. The processes of change are more clearly visible in the transformation of the tribal or folk cults, tribal eco-zones called Thinai, deities of which are incorporated into Hinduism. The rich corpus of Tamil literature called the Sangam anthologies, which is not available, which is similar to which no literature is available in Deccan and Andhra regions, is an important source of information. The Sangam anthologies present an uneven socio-economic milieu in different eco-zones, each with its own deity, worshipped in typical tribal tradition with an intensely humanistic approach. The late Sangam classics introduce us to a new era in Tamil culture and a new milieu to Tamil religion and worship, marking the change from the nature landscape of the Sangam works to the temple or sacred place landscape of the Bhakti hymns. The idea of an absolute or universal Godhead enters the Tamil ethos, which is alien to the Sangam anthologies. The Sangam anthologies are manifestly non-religious in character, except for the intensely humanistic, anthropocentric forms of worship, centering around the eco-zone deities like Murugan in the Kurinji region, Kottravai in the Palai region, and Mal of Mullai region. Mal is Vishnu. The transformation is marked by new regional synthesis of the Puranic forms. The local or folk cults were either completely merged with or remained as major components of the Puranic pantheon. Such processes were complex and emphasized the need for further exploration into regions other than Tamilagam. Tamilagam is mainly researched by many American scholars as well as Indian scholars, whereas the other regions have just been taken up. The transformative process reaches its culmination in the Bhakti poetry of the early medieval period. Belonging to two distinct genres of literature, the Sangam works represent heroic poetry, while the Bhakti hymns represent religious poetry. Again, the Bhakti poetry of Tamilagam has no counterparts in the Deccan and Andhra, thus making comparative studies difficult. Archaeological evidence for the emergence of Brahmanical structures and sculptures marking this change in a few excavated sites are found only in Deccan and Andhra, and in the Tamil region it is minimal. On the contrary, the rich epigraphical records in Prakrit found in Deccan and Andhra, monumental remains in both these regions occur mostly in Buddhist sites, and they far outweigh the evidence from sites with Brahmanical remains. Again, it is a situation of contrast, as in Tamilagam, neither for the Buddhist nor for the Brahmanical religious structures is there any significant evidence in archaeological context, with some exceptions like Kaveripum Pattinam for Chola as a Chola port and Urayur as a Chola capital. The Brahmi inscriptions in Tamil, using a few Prakrit terms, and the Prakrit inscriptions of Deccan and Andhra mark yet another difference in the nature of sources between these two major culture regions of South India. Further, even within Tamilagam, a marked difference exists between the nature of the Sangam sources and the early Tamil Brahmi records on the one hand, and the new kinds of formulaic bilingual royal charters and the Tamil religious literature of the early medieval period on the other. Bilingual charters have both Sanskrit and Tamil in the same inscription, Sanskrit section and Tamil section. This points to a disjunction, introducing the use of Sanskrit as a language of the elite and the cultural forms and institutions of the Brahmanical tradition, such as the Brahmadeya and the temple, with new ways of integration, new ways of agrarian organization, and regional political formations. The Puranas and Dharma Shastra became the canonical and normative texts guiding this change. The changing religious milieu is expressed by the central concept of bhakti in the emotionally powerful vernacular hymns of the Alvar and Nayana. Another remarkably rich corpus of literature which is not found elsewhere, as pointed out earlier, which is of completely different genre, with the temple as its innovative focus or superordinate instrument of integration. Interestingly, when the Sangam poetry came to be systematically anthologized in the 8th century AD with the first commentary, there seems to have been an attempt to Puranize the anthologies through invocatory verses on Shiva and Vishnu. In the process of transformation, the Trinai deities, that is, ecozone deities, as either regional or universal deities, and their incorporation into Shaiva Vaishnava pantheons, we see significant developments. As for example, in the case of Tamil deity Murugan, who is equated with Subramanya as the son of Shiva in the Puranic pantheon. The Tirumurugatrupadai, a late Sangam work, creating a cultic geography of Subramanya or Murugan, using both Sanskrit and Tamil myths. Significantly, this work is made a part of the Shaiva canon only in the 14th century, which is a completely new context in which Murugan regained his position as a great god with independent temples and with sectarian organizations emerging under the influence of the Smartha revival, invoking Shankara as the founder of the 6 cults, Shanmata, with sectarian organizations of their own. Similarly, the cult of the goddess Kotravai or Durga of the Shangam Palai Thinai undergoes a similar process of assimilation as the divine consort of Shiva in the early medieval Puranic tradition. And yet, her individual traits, both as the benevolent mother and the malevolent goddess of victory, remains a continuous theme in literature, with a violent imagery in war poetry, and by the 14th century, she regains her individual status with separate temples, often overshadowing Shiva, as in the case of Madurai Meenakshi temple, where first it was not Meenakshi, but Sundareshwara, who was the main deity in the early medieval times. There is no reference in the inscriptions to Meenakshi anywhere till you come to the Vijayanagara and Nayak periods. Meenakshi superseded her male consort Shiva in the medieval period as the main deity within the Brahmanical tradition. There is a general increase in goddess temples, especially in areas like the Kongu region, present-day Coimbatore and Erode, etc. The innumerable female goddesses of the south do not coalesce into a single great goddess, as in the Brahmanical tradition represented by the Devi Mahatmya. It must be added that the period in which their cultic importance is revived coincides with the emergence of several lower agricultural and non-agricultural occupational groups as economically more influential in a greatly diversified social and economic context. In the Shangam period, we do not have references to temples, but only to cult centers, to which people are advised to go and worship. The universalization of the Trinai deities and the institutionalization of the cult center as a Brahmanical temple with Brahmanical forms of worship is an early medieval development in a totally transformed socio-political context. In contrast, the Deccan and Andhra Buddhist centers had already emerged with chaityas and viharas as highly organized institutions and symbols of the community, with the monastic vihara of the Sangha as a center of control and authority. The transition from a predominantly commercial economy to a new agrarian order based on land grants to Brahmanas and to temples also marks the Deccan and Andhra region. The transition towards the emergence of the Puranic tradition therefore takes place from the 4th century to 6th century in the northern parts of peninsular India and from 6th century in the southern parts of peninsular India. Its crystallization as a dominant one, ushering in a new socio-political order with the emergence of monarchical polities. There are at least 40 polities in Deccan and Andhra, small ones mentioned in most of the texts on South India. The two major Puranic religions of Shaivism and Vaishnavism were not yet polarized in the form of sectarian organizations. The composite package in which Brahminical tradition was handed down is reinforced by the epigraphic records of the new Brahminical polities such as the Vakatakas, Kadambas, Vishnukundis, and the early Pallavas, as also by the elaborate Puranic myths and rites of worship and the Dharmashastric forms of socio-political organization. Thus emerged two major integrative forces of the Brahmanas, the Brahmadeya and the Puranic temple, as instruments of change, apart from the Ghatika and Vidyasthana as the Brahmanical institutions of learning. The early dynasties of Deccan and Andhra, Vakatakas, Vishnukundis, and even the Pallavas claim to be of Brahma Kshatriya Kula. Somehow, the Brahmana Kshatriya nexus is already reflected in the Brahmanical texts. The Tamil Bhakti movement had greater impact on the socio-religious developments of the Tamil region, defying the Brahmanical norms of society. Developed systematically by the Alvar and followed by the Nayanar, this vernacular Bhakti tradition registered a protest against Brahmana orthodoxy and their exclusiveness in the social and religious sphere, that is, access to divine grace and salvation, and elitism in the religious sphere. More significantly, it expressed a deep-rooted rivalry against the non-Brahmanical religions of Buddhism and Jainism, which had by now gained considerable following in South India, under the patronage of some ruling families like the Gangas, Pallavas, and Pandyas. It succeeded in providing the basis for a dominant ideology consciously promoted by the ruling families like Cholas, who founded the most enduring regional state in South India and is comparable to none in North India. Chola state is unusually large and also lasted for 400 years. The Alvar and Nayanar Bhakti brings several strands together: the typical Sangam Tamil humanism, anthropocentric religion, emotional and sensuous character of worship, it is including ecstatic dancing and singing, and the northern Brahminical concept of a transcendental absolute monotheism, together with several mythological structures. The Tamil Bhakti hymns express, therefore, their dissent from protest against the orthodox Vedic Brahmanas, or what are called Chaturvedis, along with a strong criticism of the temple administrators for their Varna hierarchy and claims to purity and proximity to the divine. The saints put devotion or bhakti above caste hierarchy, denouncing the followers of the law books and their kula and gotra. The social context in which this opposition arose is the change from a predominantly urban and commercial economy to a new agrarian system based on land grants made by the newly emerging ruling families to Brahmanas as Chaturvedis, along with special privileges, economic, administrative, and political, and the ruling families deriving legitimacy and Kshatriya status from the genealogical claims in their eulogies or prasastis of the bilingual charters, which were mentioned earlier. The managerial control assigned to the Brahmanas over the Brahmadeya and Agrahara settlements and also over temples was crucial in the process of integration of pre-existing pastoral agricultural settlements, even sometimes towns, which I mentioned in yesterday's lecture as Nagaram. Peasant regions, forest regions, and other lands were also gradually brought into the agrarian organization of the Brahmanical tradition. The institutionalization of land grants to Brahmanas as Brahmadeya and temple as Devadana, both in rural areas and later urban areas, for mobilizing and redistributing resources is therefore a very significant development. The new dynasties were themselves Kshatriyaized in the Brahmanical social order and provided with divine descent and impressive lineage claims. New forms of art, iconography, and architecture in permanent materials like stone appeared with the temple. Thus, we have the best of the Dravida temples, the Tanjavur Vimana, which is over 200 feet high, like the Jagannath temple in Puri and also the Angkor Wat in Cambodia. They also evolved significant variations in the regional pantheons of of the Puranic Shiva and Vishnu, apart from iconographic forms, which convey different levels of meaning through symbol and metaphor, in equating the temporal sovereign, that is king, with the divine sovereign, that is God. Epic and Puranic myths were popularized through visual narratives of great aesthetic merit, that is, sculptures and paintings, and iconic forms of deities representing pantheons of power are found in the temples, which have been carefully preserved by the archaeological survey through their photographs, as well as some stray finds during their explorations. This is best exemplified in the narrative and iconic representations of the Chalukya sites of Badami, Aihole, and Patadakal, those of the Rashtrakutas at Ellora, and those of the Pallavas and Pandyas in Kanchipuram and around Madurai, which were innovative visual texts. While the pantheons were increasingly elaborated, added to, and standardized the Chola and Vijayanagara temples. The temple itself draws its plan from cosmic structures, this is very important, and is designed to symbolize cosmos through the representation of Shiva in the Brahmasthana of the Vastu Purusha Mandala. That's what is called, the temple plan is called Vastu Purusha Mandala. And Vedic deities were made into Digpalas and Lokapalas in the periphery as Padadevatas. They are not in the shrine, they are not anywhere around the main temple, but they are in the periphery of the Vimana and the temple itself. It is also significant that royal temples follow an iconographic scheme, which is often meant to convey a political iconography, royal imagery, with different levels of meaning through metaphor and symbol, whereas all other temples, whether it's agrarian or urban institution, followed the agamic canons of iconography. The temple iconography of the Chola period was often directly derived from the poetic iconography of the Bhakti hymns. In the royal temples, the imaging of Shiva in sculptures and paintings in appropriate niches convey clearly a political iconography, thus becoming a visually more powerful text. The Bhakti hymnists were not creating only a text, but also its context in the form of a sacred geography of the Puranic pantheon, which coincided with the agrarian political geography of the Chola period. The Cholas replicated the temple as the institutional focus in all centers associated with Bhakti saints, or even those which are new and not associated with Bhakti saints. Tanjavur is not associated with the Bhakti saints, for example. More important is the evolution of a cultic geography within the region, a regional pilgrimage network, some of which were later became major sacred centers of Shiva and Vishnu in a larger pan-Indian pilgrimage network from the period of Vijayanagara. When attempts were made to bring all the strands of the Brahminical and non-Brahminical folk traditions within the ambit of the Hindu framework in the Vijayanagara period, a period of synthesis of Vedic and non-Vedic traditions where a homogenization occurs. The local cult priests were evidently integrated into the new order of worship as priests, based on the Puranas and Agamas, but they were assigned a lower status among the Brahmanas, the temple priests being called Navlakas, and were given a position lower to that of the Vedic scholars and the scholars of the Dharma Shastras. The Shaiva Bhakti saints, whose number came to be fixed at 63, this is a borrowal from the Jaina Salaka Purushas 63, they were drawn from various social strata, from the Brahmana to the Paraya. Paraya is untouchable. They were canonized gradually from the 9th to the 12th centuries, when the famous hagiographical text called the Periya Puranam, the big Purana, was written at the court of Kulothunga to the Chola. It was composed in a new historical context, marking a societal crisis caused by a sectarian rivalry between the Shaivas and Vaishnavas, and also due to a diversified economy with non-agricultural occupational groups becoming increasingly influential, and even the high caste agricultural Velala castes competing for a greater share in the authority structure, which was really dominated by the Brahmanas earlier. Ritual singing of the Bhakti hymns was introduced even by the 9th century. By the 16th century, the name Devaram. Devaram is sung even today in the God's processions. Was given to the Bhakti hymns, representing the Tamil scriptural tradition. What is of importance for the development of Shaivism was the incorporation of all forms of Shaiva teachers. The Kalamukas, Pasupatas were all non-conformist and non-Vedic, and even the wandering and unorganized social ascetic group known as the Siddhas into the Shaiva hagiographical tradition. What was really being achieved was the incorporation of all social groups and even radical elements like the Siddhas into the mainstream of Shaiva tradition, which negated the Vedic and Smarta traditions by making Shiva the giver of the Veda. Shiva is now supposed to be the author of the Vedas. He is also called the Sanskrit of the north and the Tamil of the south. By calling the Tamil hymns the Tamil Marai, Marai means Veda, a clear reversal of the normal orthodox position. The idea was to establish the Tamil hymns, both Vaishnava and Shaiva, as scriptures, Marai, equal to the Vedas, to invest the hymns with authority. In this respect, the Sri Vaishnava teachers were more successful in relating the Sanskrit Vedic tradition to the Tamil Sri Vaishnava doctrine and practice. This was a result of the conscious rendering of the Tamil Bhakti in Puranic structures, namely the Bhagavata Purana, which was written in South India by the 9th century AD, and the highly stimulating debate on the Vedanta, which Ramanuja's Visishta Advaita evoked from the 12th century. The Visishta Advaita, which means qualified non-dualism, provided a philosophical base to Sri Vaishnavism, thereby evolving the Ubhaya Vedanta, which was more conducive to the devotional cult, which the stark absolutism or Advaita, non-dualism, and the Mayavada of Shankara could not provide for the progress of the Puranic tradition in the early medieval period. Later, Shaiva Siddhanta philosophers of the 13th, 14th centuries indeed made serious efforts to build a strong philosophical base for Shaivism, and they adopted Shiva as the Brahman discussed by Shankara, the Saguna Brahman. Counter traditions like the Jains and Buddhists were constantly decried in the Bhakti hymns and also in the hagiographical literature. A major theme, therefore, is the claim of the Brahmanical tradition as the orthodox in opposition to the Jain and Buddhist religions as the heterodox sects. There is an expression of a profound reaction to these counter ideologies, ridiculing the Jains in various ways. The Bhakti exponents represent royal conversion from Jainism to the Shaiva fold as a major achievement, as the latter was the true religion. This is consistently used in the Vaishnava and Shaiva textual tradition to exalt the Puranic forms of worship. Henceforth, the constant emphasis on a revival theory, a revival of Brahmanical tradition, both in literature and in inscriptions of the 6th to 9th centuries, and even in later hagiographical literature. In the development of the canonical traditions of both Shaivism and Vaishnavism, also we notice the same idea. The notion of scripture develops with the written text, which then becomes the focus of beliefs. In both cases of Shaivism and Vaishnavism, the hymns were later collected and arranged as a text, creating a textual tradition, with the text undergoing a reworking or elaboration through interpretive strategies while they were redacted. The contemporary context, socio-economic and political, become crucial in understanding the evolution of the textual tradition. Thus, we can see three stages in the evolution of Shaiva canonical tradition, Devaram being the first group of hymns. The second and ritual singing of the hymns is a part of the practical rite introduced in the temple. The Chola royal family enhanced their own importance as an ideological instrument using bhakti for building up a regional state and apotheosis of the Nayanar reaching its high point in the 12th century, proving the role of the Devaram and hagiography as text and continuing context of the Chola ideological statement and the Shaiva community's authoritative symbols. Anywhere you ask, the moment you talk about Shaiva tradition, they'll talk about Devaram and Periya Purana. The final stage saw the canonization of all the saints, the conscious restructuring of the text as Tirumurai, Sri Veda, Murai is Veda, along with the later philosophical treatises authored by religious leaders with a new institutional force, namely the Matha or monastery. They copied from Buddhist and Jain tradition. Then the Matha becomes the custodian of the canonical tradition, and their discourse became authoritative base of the new religiosity and sectarian organization of the Saiva community. The Matha's activities were intensified from the 13th, 14th centuries under very much revered Shaiva Siddhanta leaders, which includes Umapati Shivacharya, a very famous Shaiva Siddhanta leader, like Ramanuja for Sri Vaishnavism. Umapati made the most significant contribution to the canon and achieved a remarkable conflation of the Vedanta and Shaiva Siddhanta. The attempts of religious leaders were invariably directed towards a re-authentication of regional religious traditions through Vedic or Sanskritic norms, and to give every ritual a Vedic origin and every concept a Vedantic source. We can also see such matters appearing in Madhya Pradesh. They are still being researched. Very important research comes from one of the leading religious historians of Madhya Pradesh. Vedicization was consciously adopted in the Vijayanagara period in order to create a pan-Indian legitimating ideology. Notably, it was a period marked by the decline of the regional state and the beginnings of a larger territorial integration with shifting centers of power, namely Vijayanagara in Karnataka. The Sri Vaishnava textual tradition is highly complex and multi-dimensional, comprising of liturgical, theological, philosophical, commentarial, and hagiographical, in all of which a duality and often a multiplicity of scriptural authority is used. No religious tradition in India has a single final text as its scripture, or as we have Bible or Quran, etc. You can't quote any one as the main scripture. So much of complexity exists. While the Shaiva Devaram has no commentaries, a rich commentarial tradition developed around the Vaishnava hymnal literature, which is called Divya Prabandham. The Vaishnavas also evolved a dual tradition by consciously writing in Sanskrit. Their philosophy and commentarial works are in Sanskrit, and in Tamil also the commentarial literature exists. A symbolic language called the Mani Pravalam for their commentarial and hagiographical texts was evolved by the Sri Vaishnavas. Legitimation was sought for the hymnal literature by associating them with the Vedas. Here they are called Dravida Veda, in imitation of the Sanskrit Veda, and at the same time emphasizing the importance and universality of Tamil and vernacular idioms drawn from Shangam classical works. At one level, it blended harmoniously with the pan-Indian tradition, and at another it provided a regional dimension to tradition and community. In theology, Pancharatra and Vaikhanasa still followed in all the temples, but particularly Tirupati is well known for its Vaikhanasa Agama, which is followed in all the rituals. They carried out further innovations with a more liberal attitude towards the lower orders of society, as seen in the social and ritual reforms in Sri Rangam introduced by Ramanuja. The Sri Vaishnavas therefore presented a succession of religious leaders, preserving a claimed continuity. It's not a real continuity, from Ramanuja of the 12th century to the present day. He was the founder. Guru Paramparas became very common and they were very carefully preserved. And they were powerful families which are highly visible during contestations over power and resources, especially the huge temple estates and matha properties, which significantly increased during the Vijayanagara period and afterwards. The building up of a large Sri Vaishnava community, despite the major schism into the Vadagalai, northern, and Tengalai, southern, and diversification into lesser lineages of matha heads and individual families, led to many of these families wielding great political influence in the Vijayanagara royal court, in the changing socio-political context of the medieval imperial powers, and also under their subordinates called the Nayakas, were later called Palivars. The 12th century also witnessed the emergence of yet another counter-tradition in Karnataka, namely the Veerashaiva movement, a major opposition to Brahmanical orthodoxy and social order. It led to the evolution of the Lingayat community. Lingayat is a religious community which later became a caste, ultimately ossified into a caste. It was founded by Basava, a minister of the Kalachuri court, and the Lingayats movement has been given a radical character in its initial phase, registering a protest in their vachanas. Vachana is prose writing, and that is where the earliest texts express their opposition to caste hierarchy, gender inequality, rejection of ritual pollution, and advocacy of sanctity of all work. They have emphasized all this to project them as an aggressive or militant sect. The historical context of the progress of the Veerashaiva movement are also therefore very significant, as it began at a time of major economic diversification, non-agricultural and trading occupations gaining importance first in the 12th century, more intensively in the 15th, 16th centuries in the Vijayanagara period. Now, contemporary needs often determine the selection of the past. The Veerashaivas started with a protest and radicalism, defying existing structures, but later they also developed the same ideals and institutions of the same kind as the Brahmanical tradition. They took over the Kalamukha and Pasupata temples and were inspired by the Upanishadic, yogic, and agamic ideals to construct a new universe. In the Andhra region, the Aradhya Shaivas also contributed to this alternative universe. After Vijayanagara decline in the 17th century and the rise of smaller or little kingdoms like the Keladis, intense competition among the monasteries for primacy and patronage led to divergent voices. The innumerable mathas, both supralocal and smaller local ones, evolved not only a monastic network, which was parallel with the small political chiefly authorities, but also received many grants in the post-Vijayanagara period and had by now created micro-zones of power or authority for themselves with substantial resources, both agricultural and commercial, under their control. The 14th-16th century period is therefore a watershed in South India's socio-religious history, when two phenomena of equal importance become dominant. Two interrelated developments in the Vijayanagara period were, one, the impact of Shankara's Advaita, which had no visible influence in his own period. Shankara is dated in the 8th, 9th centuries AD. The other change was a return to or a second Vedicization or second sensitization from about the 13th, 14th centuries. For the first time, serious commentaries on the Vedas were composed. We don't have commentaries till the 14th century. Authentic biographies of the Vedantins like Shankara and Ramanuja were also written. Vedic authenticity which was reversed in the Tamil religious literature, was now being sought in the Vedanta for re-establishing a Smarta tradition through the establishment of Shankara Mathas, the earliest of which are known only from the 13th century AD. The Matha henceforth becomes a major institutional force in South India to uphold and preserve the Shaiva, Vaishnava, and Smarta traditions and the focus of the community's identity. Fair amount of Vedic chants were also included in the Chola period, but there were no separate mandapas or halls for Vedic sacrifices. But now, in the Vijayanagar period, apart from the inclusion of a fair amount of Vedic chants, we also find Yajna mandapas separately being erected for the purpose of performing Vedic Yajna. That is from the 14th century. However, the Yajna here is offered not to the nature personified Vedic deities, but to Shiva or to Vishnu. In the regional traditions, they were becoming the Brahman of Shankara's Smarta tradition. The Vijayanagar period thus marked a new socio-political and economic context. It was a mixed rural and urban economy, with a society and economy in a constant state of flux. Politically, it witnessed a major shift in the center of power to the Deccan, and new rivals for power like the Muslim sultanates, larger territorial integration, introduction of new military technologies and defense systems due to Turkish invasions and later Mughal invasions. Military chiefs like Nayakas, to whom Vijayanagara delegated their power. The migration of such warriors to the peripheries and their participation in temple building and endowments becomes a major feature of the Vijayanagar and post-Vijayanagar period. New entrants into all these spheres of activity has therefore to be accommodated. And thus, temple society expanded. The Matha thus also emerged as community's leading instrument of integration, and monarchism provided the basis for a parallel authority structure. Yet another development is very interesting, which is the vertical right and left hand divisions called Valangai and Idangai castes, which enabled the incorporation of all non-agricultural groups and other marginal groups into temple ritual and administration, albeit below the priestly Brahmana elite and non-Brahmana landowning and warrior groups. It became a root paradigm for social organization, with more intensive conflicts for mobility from left to right-hand divisions. As a larger peninsular state, including Tamil, Telugu, and Kannada regions, Vijayanagara was seeking a legitimating ideology which could supersede regional and sub-regional forms of legitimacy. This was provided by a series of interrelated developments from the 13th century, which we have already delineated. The Vijayanagara rulers consciously, therefore, promoted a high degree of Sanskritization. All the Tamil names of places were Sanskritized once again. Even now, we do not know what Vedaranyam means. Vedaranyam in Tamil is Tirumaraikadu. All the Tamil names or Kannada names were Sanskritized. All the Tamil texts were rendered through Sanskrit media for the purpose of making them authentic. A high degree of Sanskritization, more correctly Vedicization, this is a term which I like rather, because it is a Vedicization properly done for the regional traditions of religion. It brought the Varna hierarchy to the fore in the institutional structures and authority relationships. The attempt was more at synthesizing Northern Sanskritic and the by now widely popular Tamil and other traditions in the canons of the respective sects, tracing their source to Vedic tradition to establish great antiquity. While commentaries on the Vedas and on philosophical systems derived from the Vedanta at one level enhanced their status with a pan-Indian legitimacy, the other regional aspects proclaimed the Vijayanagara rulers as lords of the southern regions. Thus, from mid-14th century, under Vijayanagara, after nearly 6 centuries, Shankara is claimed by Smarta and Shaiva and even Vaishnava sects as having given them an unassailable base for their central concept of Godhead. The Vedas got their first systematic commentaries, that of Sayana. Various philosophies came to be debated upon ceaselessly from now on, as early seen the early works of Madhava in Sringeri, called the Sarva Darshana Sangraha. The much later Sthala Mahatmyas and Temple Chronicles, they are not early, they are all after Vijayanagar, mainly. Sthala Mahatmyas and Temple Chronicles, such as Chidambara Mahatmya, incorporate all these developments in their accounts, glorifying the holy centers and their temples as pilgrimage literature. The Sthala Puranas and Mahatmyas and other pilgrimage literature were composed during and post Vijayanagar and post Vijayanagar periods, reflecting this process, once again reiterating the idea of community above caste. Finally, we see that Shankara becomes the center of creating, which he is claimed descent from Shankara's name. His philosophy was not present in his own scheme of religion, having been established by Shankara, which is not acceptable. The Shakta, Kaumara, Ganapatya cults, also derived from popular forms, were given sectarian positions after Shankara's Smartha tradition. It was therefore a revival of folk forms with Brahmanical legitimacy. Even the Vedic Surya is brought into this scheme of Shanmata as Saura, sect called Saura. They claim that Adi Shankara himself established matas, that he composed as many as 400 texts on various is of doubtful authenticity. The works genuinely of Shankara's authorship are only the Bhashyas, commentaries, Prasthana Trayi, Bhashyas on Vedanta, Brahma Sutra, and Bhagavad Gita. There seems to be an attempt here at homogenization through Brahmanical and Sanskrit norms, a revival of Vedic orthodoxy from above by royalty and their preceptors or cult leaders. This could well have provided the basis for all future attempts, including the colonial and Orientalist constructions of the 19th, 20th centuries, to establish a common source, though consciously constructed, for all religious traditions and communities in India. Hence, it is presented as a single monolithic Hindu community. However, Vijayanagara could not do away with the duality in community identities. Therefore, we have in northern and southern, in Sanskrit and Tamil or Kannada, this oscillation between caste and community identities becomes enhanced in the post-Vijayanagara situation, and it even persists to this day. And we see people using caste identity at one place, community identity in another place simultaneously. This is one of the most interesting developments of the Vijayanagara, post-Vijayanagara periods. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that amazing, illustrious lecture. And today we are also honored because we are joined by Professor Romila Thapar from Delhi. Thank you for joining, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving this lecture, Professor Champak Lakshmi. It was truly an honor, a lifetime opportunity for all of us to listen to you today. And in the series of two lectures that you presented, first on the urbanization and the second on the making of a religious tradition pre-colonial South India, both of them will be available on YouTube for people who want to listen to them, and it is saved for posterity. So for those of you who are interested in research can refer to these lectures in times to come. Thank you so much, everybody who joined us on this Zoom call and on Facebook. And for if you have any question for Professor Champak Lakshmi, you can email us at karwanheritage@gmail.com. It is KARWWAN, karwanheritage@gmail.com, and we'll try to get those answers from Professor Champak Lakshmi. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a great evening.